Under growing pressure, the government suddenly had new details today about how often the Canadian military has halted the transfer of Afghan detainees. They are bombshell allegations of torture, detailed in public today by a senior Canadian diplomat. The government rejected calls for a public inquiry into the alleged torture of Afghan prisoners today.
Ha! How many times did the CBC retail those lies and smears and rumors against our troops? Was it 100? Was it 1,000? And when finally, after a $12 million investigation, proved them to be based on nothing, well, we're still waiting for the apology. Hey, joining me now to talk about government broadcasters, not just in Canada but around the world, is a professor of international relations and political science, our old friend Aurel Braun. Thanks for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
Now, you study regimes that have different degrees of political freedom, and let's be candid, in Canada we are one of the freest countries.
Absolutely.
I think it's all the more reason why the CBC is an anomaly in our country that must be removed. Put this in global context. Tell me about other state broadcasters, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, one of the first things that we look to when we are examining regime change, it is the problem that the media has to be free, that there has to be a degree of objectivity. So we very carefully monitor what happens in the case of the press and especially television. Most people get in the new democracies or emerging democracies get their information on television. And what those who advise, those people who are particularly concerned and advise on this on transitions will say to governments and to officials is that look at good models, look at models like Canada. But the problem is often we don't examine our own models sufficiently. So what we see in the most extreme cases, we expect that they would be biased. You look at the Chinese Central Television, we know that it is fundamentally a propaganda organ. But then we look at a place like Russia, which claims to have been moving towards democracy, and national television has become increasingly a propaganda tool of the Putin-Medvedev regime.
Compare now. What is the name of the Russian media outlet that is most the voice of Vladimir Putin? And can you compare the CBC to that Russian case? Because we're not talking about Soviet Russia. We're talking about modern, semi-democratic Russia.
Exactly.
Make a comparison.
We can't really say that they are the same because those are very obviously state-owned. There's not that level of separation, and the propaganda is relentless. But what I'm concerned with is that when we look at how any news organization that is funded by government functions, there's a philosophical problem and there's a structural problem. So the better comparison would be, let's say, with the BBC or National French Television, which is state-owned. And here the risk is the kind of subtle dangers that you expect objectivity because this is a democracy. France, Britain, the BBC has this enormous reputation worldwide. It is the largest news organization in the world, but it is also a very heavily biased organization. And what makes that problematic is that there's an expectation of objectivity. There's a reputation for objectivity that is just not correct.
So maybe we're more on guard when we're watching Communist China's official broadcast or even a Putin network.
Or even in Russia.
Yeah, because it's like when you're listening to a TV ad, your skepticism is up. But when you're watching the state broadcaster in France, Britain, or Canada, maybe, we're not in a tyranny. I can accept everything I hear at face value.
Exactly. And this is what is so essential in a democracy, that you have to have very sensitive antennae to watch for any possibility of distortion. You expect that from certain networks, which are fairly upfront. They will say, we represent a basically conservative perspective. But when you have something that is arm's length, that is supposed to have a mechanism of ensuring objectivity, you don't expect that. So you have to have people become very engaged. In France, for instance, they decided, the government, that they want to do away with commercials for French national television. So this sounded like a good proposition, except people began to worry that in essence, by becoming more involved in funding, French national television that is owned by the state will become more of a tool for promoting Sarkozy. And I think this was very, very important.
Let's talk about, in the United States, National Public Radio and PBS, the TV station. Both of these have an element of government control. Now, here's a comparison we made for our viewers. On the left is what they call the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So that's PBS and National Public Radio. They get $430 million from the U.S. government. In Canada, and we're a country 1/10 the size, we give almost triple the amount of money to our state broadcaster. What do you make of this comparison? And can you talk about NPR and PBS's role in the American media market versus the CBC's role in the Canadian media market?
Well, when you compare, let's say, PBS and NPR in the United States, and you compare it to CBC or the BBC, the American publicly funded networks do not occupy the same kind of central role as the BBC.
They're not dominant.
The BBC is absolutely dominant in Britain. There are private networks, but the Beeb is the big gun in town. They have a budget of about $7 billion. And so when you look at CBC, CBC also occupies an extremely powerful position. So even if you say that the fact that something is government owned or funded primarily, or even if there's a significant government funding, that might somehow distort the market or might have an influence. As a whole, in the United States, public broadcasting does not occupy as large a space as it does in Canada or Britain or France.
So in terms of dominance, that's, I mean, again, we're obviously a freer country than the former Soviet Union.
No question about it.
But in terms of dominance in the marketplace, our CBC model is by far the biggest gorilla on the block, whereas in the United States, it's almost insignificant. But how important is that in terms of setting the tone for the national news discussion every day? I mean, if the government broadcaster basically has the biggest megaphone, how can that affect dissident voices or contrary voices or just plain old competitive voices?
Well, this is where you have both a philosophical problem. Should there be any government-owned kind of broadcasting? In countries, all democratic countries have basically market economies. So can we justify philosophically that in a market economy you have that kind of government involvement of ownership, even if it's through some sort of crown corporation, even if it is an arm's length relationship? The second element is structural, that is both internally, what are the mechanisms to ensure fairness? And second, how does it fit in with the rest of the kind of media marketplace? And if it occupies a very large role, it will have an outsized influence.
Yeah,
and if you have an outsized influence, especially when there's that objectivity expectation, then you've got a problem. And this is why you look for subtleties, you look for early warning signs. So you're not going to have the BBC play the same role as in Russia. They're not going to say, this is the government we want elected, and we're going to focus on David Cameron, on every single adventure and so on. That is not the danger. But you will see the bias in the Middle East of the BBC. Yeah. You will see the bias in Afghanistan. And it is corrosive, and that is the danger in democracy. These kind of organizations play a corrosive role in terms of the checks and balances that are so essential in a democracy.
You're right. When the government is the check and balance on the government, it's a bit of a card game. Hey, Professor Aurel Braun, thanks very much for giving us that global perspective. We've got a lot more, folks. We're going to talk next to a conservative MP who will tell us about a political appetite to take on this boondoggle. After the break, we'll talk with Rob Anders. That's next on The Source.